Hello, all, and welcome back to a new episode of Movies and Us, a weekly gathering place filled with conversations about movies, stories, and connection. My name is Jennifer Hahn.
And I'm Sarah Callan.
And today we're going to be reviewing the film Anora. Sarah, do you want to kick us off with an IMDb summary for Anora?
Sure. A young escort from Brooklyn meets and impulsively marries the son of a Russian oligarch. Once the news reaches Russia, her fairy tale is threatened as his parents set out for New York to get the marriage annulled.
All right. Let's start off in Movies and Us tradition with our one-sentence summaries for this film. Sarah, what is yours?
Mine is, beware the oligarchs and their kids.
Yeah. Please, PSA, beware.
Yeah, just stay away.
My goodness, yes. My one-sentence summary is, if Uncut Gems had a little sister.
Honestly, though, like...
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Oh, man. Okay. Well, let's dive right in. We will share our high-level thoughts about Anora, and we won't spoil this movie quite yet. This has been a film that has been there's just been so much energy around this movie and so many great reviews that I've been reading. So this was definitely a curious watch for me that I was just like, I wonder what the hype's all about. So, Sarah, I'm curious how you received this film.
Yeah, so this is now my second time watching this, and I think both times I was just shocked at how funny I found this film to be. There are certain scenes that should probably be horrifying, and yet I found myself laughing during, and so that's just something that's really struck me both times. But yeah, this film really worked for me, and I think it really effectively shows, especially in the beginning, Annie getting really swept up in this life, and I think through the way that it's filmed like Uncut Gems, I think shows that intoxication of this lifestyle. And then once everything starts just spiraling out of control, that filmmaking style, I feel like, makes it just so tense and just chaotic to watch. But there's something about it that I also found to be really funny. And then Annie is just a character that I just wanted to root for. I was like, girl, you are the most competent person in this film. I need you to get out of this and be okay. So I was rooting for her in this really wild situation that she found herself in. And even though this film is stressful and chaotic and crazy, I definitely had a good time with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man, this film just, it grabs you and sucks you in. Like, you have to give yourself over to this movie. There's a lot of different tones that this film strikes that I found really fascinating. So, like, the first act, the middle, and then this ending, I think all are so different. And I think they really like slap you in the face every time it changes tone. And sometimes that doesn't work in a film. But I think it's actually one of this film's greatest strengths, especially that ending. Oh my gosh. And so, man, I found myself needing time to just like sit with this movie afterwards and think about it and process it, because there's just so much that's happening. And similar to Uncut Gems, you are so steeped in it over the course of the film that you almost like don't have time to think or process anything that's happening, similar to our main character. And so when it's all over, I felt breathless. I felt like I needed to like, what just happened, you know? There's a lot in here that I think is really great from a technical perspective that I think really supports the film's message and thesis. Also makes for some really funny moments. That this audio mixing is incredible on this movie. Some of the funniest moments are these small little throwaway lines that you hear characters say in the background that I thought were really great, but also adds to the feeling of chaos and the thesis around Annie never being acknowledged or seen or heard by any of these men that are around her. And I thought that the way that those things are working together just was really, really well done. So shout out to the way that the technical aspects really support the emotional and overall thesis of the film. Really good.
Yeah, I was so struck by the sound mixing this time. And there's so many moments when Annie is in a really loud environment and she's at a club or she's at a party or whatever, and you're just enveloped in this sound, and it's almost so loud that you can't hear yourself think. And the characters are talking and they're yelling at each other, but you can barely hear them over the music. And then it'll just cut to silence. And those really jarring moments, you hear those throughout the film. And then visually, there are also moments like that. There are so many quick cuts and these changes in scenery, and even the way that montages are done. Like, you are just, like you said, you are swept up in this film. This film is moving 1,000 miles an hour, and you have to get along for the ride. And I'm so impressed at how all of those technical components, they're so jarring, and yet it's not off-putting, but it's almost an invitation to go deeper as Annie is also going deeper into this world.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The feeling of space and mood, this film has somehow nailed really, really well. And you are immersed. And if you want to try and escape, you can't, like you are stuck in these environments with these people. And just the way that she feels like she can't get out and she's stuck here, like we as the viewers are also stuck there with her. And man, that the way that the film ends, I think, is really fascinating. We can get into that in spoilers, but that sense of volume, I think, is really a fascinating contrast between the middle section and the ending as well, which I think is really effective.
And like you said, the ending leaves you breathless. And so it's, for most of the movie, you've been going at this breakneck speed. It's been loud. It's been fast cuts. It's just been this constant movement, constant going, constant chaos. And then the ending scene is so jarring on so many levels. And then it's just quiet. And you watch the credits roll and you're just like, whoa, I need to take a moment and breathe and just process what in the world I just witnessed. So the fact that the movie takes you on such a visceral journey and you're enjoying the ride. I think that's what's so fascinating to me. And I love the comparison to Uncut Gems, but with Uncut Gems, I never wanted to watch that movie again. It's so good. It's so well done. Once was enough for me. And I, for some reason, have now watched it twice. But I didn't feel that way with Anora. Even though Anora is very similar stylistically, I was happy to watch this a second time. And I find that really interesting that even though there's so many similarities, I think that there's something about Anora and the pacing, and maybe it's the character of Annie, that I didn't feel as overwhelmed after Anora as I did Uncut Gems.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Uncut Gems doesn't have quite as much like lighthearted fun that I think Anora has. I think it's like
That's true.
Designed to be as funny as well. Like the whole middle section of this movie is like a ragtag group of friends that are not actually friends that secretly hate each other in this movie, but like a comedy of errors, just the things that are going wrong. Is comical. It's played up to be comical. And then in Uncut Gems, everything's going wrong and his life is literally falling apart and it's highly stressful. So it's stressful for these characters, but it's also so big and over the top that you just can't help but laugh. Like there's a lot of like visual comedy and whatnot. So there's definitely a lot more fun that's to be had here. Agreed.
The movie that I kept thinking about while watching Anora is, it's not a good movie that I thought of, but it's called Big Trouble. It's a 2002 film. It's not a good movie, but it stars Tim Allen, Rene Russo, Stanley Tucci, and like 100 other people. And it really is just about these really incompetent, bumbling people trying to, I think it's pull off a heist or something. Like there's some criminal element to it, and everybody's incompetent. And then like these normal people get wrapped up in the incompetence. And so that middle section in Anora, when they're just bumbling and just don't know what they're doing, just made me keep thinking about Big Trouble. I'm going to have to watch that movie again because I have not watched it since, I don't know, early 2000s. So, but yeah, I just kept thinking about that in Anora and just having such a fun time in that middle section. There's something about bumbling criminals when it's done right. It is just the best time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's what we see in this movie.
And the three other male characters that are part of this bumbling crew are so like well balanced in their personalities that like gel together and collide with each other in a really fun way. So they're different enough in personality and in countenance that it makes for some really funny moments. You know, you've got Toros, who is incredibly like loud. He's kind of the leader of the group and the most stressed and the one calling the shots. And then you have Garnek, who's kind of the muscle of the group, who's kind of got this like sweet spot to him. And then Igor obviously is just rare, very reserved, but always in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so I think like the balance of their personalities and quirks also blend together really, really nicely for a really great comedic middle section.
Mm-hmm. And I think, again, it's this really funny contrast between those characters and Annie, and their personalities are so different, and seeing them interacting with each other under stress is funny, and the situation that they find themselves in is so ridiculous. It's so over the top that you just have to laugh at it. And so it's so interesting how this moment that could be stressful, terrifying, you know, like really hard. It's obviously hard for Annie in the middle of the film, but it's such a fun time because these guys are so bumbling and the premise is hilarious. And so it's just like, yeah, we're along for this crazy ride.
Honestly, in that middle section, I was just so glad Ivan was out of the picture. Like, I hope we never find this boy because he just pisses me off every time he's on screen. So I'm like, I know we're trying to find him, but I'm fine if we don't find him. I'm good. We're okay.
So Jen is not Team Ivan.
Yeah.
I wonder why. It's so surprising.
There's nothing sympathetic about him. I don't know. Maybe other people read him more sympathetically. I'm just like, this immature, spoiled brat. Just get him off my screen. Oh, God. He does his job.
Yeah,
the actor does his job well.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I just kept thinking, like, y'all have so much money. Ivan, you have so much money. Like, can we take a fraction of that and like put it in somebody else's hands who will actually do some good in the world? Like, just like, can we do something better with this money? I feel like there are a few causes I can think of off the top of my head.
You know? Yes. Let's do that. I immediately felt character empathy for the three of his entourage because I'm like, I'm so sorry you've had to deal with this absolute horror of a child who is trying to be a real adult and thinks he's a real adult. So I felt for those three dudes immediately. I'm like, all right, I empathize with you. You've been through a lot. All right, well, let's include a spoiler here. If you haven't seen Anora yet, we're going to dive right into the full plot points of the movie, and there are lots of them. So we don't want to spoil this movie. This is definitely one to go in with a white canvas on. So, all right, let's dive in. What are some of the key moments or aspects of this film that really just struck you?
Yeah, one of the moments, and we kind of talked about it without talking about it, but the middle section where Toros and the others show up at the house and Ivan leaves. And so it's just Annie with these three men who have entered her home and are, I mean, really like threatening her. And I wasn't terrified for her while watching this. And so I was so amazed by that, because that is a horrifying moment. These men tie her up and hold her down and gag her. Like, that is a terrifying thing. And yet, because of the way that it's filmed and it's edited together, it's very lighthearted, even though what you're watching is horrifying. And I think even the first time I watched this, that was one of the things that I kept thinking about. Like, I was laughing at what was going on screen, but in my brain, I was like, no, you shouldn't be laughing. This is actually pretty terrifying. And so I'm really impressed at all of those technical components and the editing choices to keep this lighthearted and fun, when that very easily could have gone into like a horror movie, basically. And yet, because of the way that this was handled and the way that it was cut together, it's still pretty fun to watch.
What's interesting about that whole sequence is that they could have leaned even more heavily into it being really lighthearted. And I think the film has this like very delicate and nuanced balance of it. It kind of teeters on some shots or moments where you're like, this is really bad, you know? And cognitively, you're like, she is not in safety right now. Like, she is in danger. But then the movie's kind of it's not taking itself too seriously. So you're like, okay, well, I guess she'll be okay. And I'm kind of laughing along. But then also, like, there's these constant, or I felt this constant, like, ping-ponging back between, like, my brain and then, like, emotionally what I was feeling at the same time, and it all getting kind of jumbled together. And so I thought that was really fascinating, because there's another way to shoot it that just you don't really feel for her safety at all. You're like, oh, here are the dudes are coming to find and complete their mission, but like they're not here to hurt her. But we don't really know that much about these characters. And so it's a toss-up. We have no idea. And I think the film straddles this really nuanced and detailed balance between allowing for enough space for it to be horrifying, but not to the point where we're not in that lighthearted headspace either. I don't know. It's a tough task, but I felt that way, particularly in that sequence. I think after they go on their whole like comedy of errors, whole sequence, like we kind of have built trust with these characters that like they're just here to do their job and they're not trying to hurt her. But especially in that beginning sequence, I felt this ping-ponging back and forth of like, this could go kind of south, and I have no idea which direction this movie's gonna go. But it's a fascinating, delicate balance that the movies has struck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a difficult one too, and yet it nails it. And like you said, it is this, I mean, what a way to introduce us to these characters too, because we meet them at this really tense, terrifying moment for Annie, and then she's forced on this tour of the city looking for Ivan with them. And what a bold way to introduce these characters that are with us for the rest of the film and are actually pretty instrumental to the rest of the film. And yeah, from there, it's just kind of like, oh, okay, we're on this weird bumbling journey where they're just taking a picture of Ivan and just asking random bystanders if they've seen them. We don't have a plan. We're maybe not super good at our jobs. Let's see where this goes.
Yeah. I wonder if some of those like setup moments before the sequence unfolds, where we're in the car with Toros and he's on the phone with his boss and he's also on the phone with Garnig, like we can kind of understand their intentions a little bit. Like, had we not had those sequences and they just show up, like, I think we'd read that whole sequence quite differently. And sure, the film can do its best to like make it feel lighthearted, but you're also, I think, meant to have a little bit of like maybe little bit of trust built with these characters, of like them being in the car and like they really are just trying to do their job. And we kind of get a little glimpse of that before they show up. And so there's a little bit more like setup context understanding for who they are that isn't just totally big giant men showing up at the house.
And I love that Tauros is at a, what is it, like a baptism or christening or whatever, and he leaves in the middle of it. Like, I think those choices and that one specifically really helps show that this is there is a comedic element here. Like, it's okay. I think, yeah, if they would have introduced these characters differently, then yeah, we would have felt very differently about that scene.
Yeah, yeah. And so we were like primed with that. But then when we get to the scene, there's some of these shots where she's tied up and she's screaming like really desperately. And those were the moments where I was like, oh, this is not good. This is really bad. But then we were primed with the comedic bit. So I'm like, well, how am I supposed to feel? You know what I mean? And I thought that was really fascinating because they give plenty of shots and moments for her tied up and screaming for help with a considerable amount of desperation and fear in her voice. And the movie's not shying away from that either, too. So it's really this like mixing of tones together that really allow for us to figure out and put us in kind of an uncomfortable headspace too. But we're laughing at the same time because we don't know what else to do as humans.
Yeah, that's fair. What else are you going to do?
Yeah. And it's something that I haven't seen a ton of other Sean Baker films, but The Florida Project is one that I got a chance to see a few years ago. And I think it was on my top 10 list for the year. I really loved that film. And one thing that I think is really fascinating is how he is able to marry together a really kind of horrifying view into a desperate situation, and yet it is accompanied by lightheartedness and whimsy and fantasy and being larger than life and more colorful than they actually are. And they're all kind of woven together and swirled together. And so he makes these situations that would be really hard to put to the big screen and somehow make them accessible. And I think that's a really fascinating aspect of Anora as well, especially when we think about the film as a whole. There's a whole like coming of age little montage segment when she's falling in love, and then or she thinks she's falling in love, or is she fooling herself? That's a whole nother set of questions. Then there's this whole comedy of errors bit, and then it hits you right in the jugular at the end. And so it's all of it. It's not one or the other or just leaning into one tone, but it's allowing for all of it to be swirled together. And so I think that's a really fascinating aspect about the way that Anora is structured, because from a topical perspective, this is a hard topic to put to the big screen, and to do it in this way and from this angle, I think is really unique and fresh and different from what you would expect.
Yeah, and each part of this film feels different than all the others. You know, you have the beginning with her and Ivan, and just caught up in just all of it. You know, that intoxicating feeling, and you're just swept up and you're going along for the ride. And then that middle section where it's like, oh, Ivan is left. Oh no, what is going on? And it's chaos and confusion and all of these dudes. And then finally that third act and the annulment, and then the ending scene. Like, there's so much in this film, and it's all so tonally different. And yet it doesn't feel out of place. All of these different tones and these shifts in filmmaking styles, they all make sense, especially given what Annie is going through at the time. And so I think because her character is at the center of all this, then all of those shifts and changes and these really interesting storytelling choices make sense, because I feel like they're mirrors of what Annie is going through in each phase of this story.
Yeah, and when you go from one tone to the next, you're just smacked in the face, you know? Like,
yeah.
and when they have that whole like coming of age indie romance montage sequence, you're kind of like la-di-da, like, oh, okay, this is her Cinderella story. You're kind of floating along with her, and then you're smacked right in the face when the dudes show up and that whole bubble is burst. And then you're on this like fun adventure with these men who kidnapped you, but it's fun and it's funny. And that bubble bursts again. And so then after the annulment happens, man, you're like, we've gone through so much of a journey. Like, what else could happen next? And even that bubble burst in that denouement sequence in the car with Igor, which I think is like so powerful and kind of the exclamation point of the film. But at every moment, like, we as the viewers are kind of caught up in the tone of the moment. And when that bubble bursts, it is just as shocking and breathless and unexpected as our main character is experiencing. And so we immediately just, again, continue to feel even more connected to her, because I'm also like, I thought we were having fun in Vegas, you know? And then the dudes show up and ring the doorbell, and that bubble, that little perfect paradise is broken into and burst, and then we usher into the next chapter. So I thought the way that the film does not allow for a soft transition between those tonal chapters is really great, and just allows us to be hit right in the face, just like our protagonist Annie is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's so interesting because it's this like she's caught up in it, having a great time, and then like you said, the bubble is burst when the guys show up, but then the additional bubble is burst of Ivan isn't who she thought he was, which I'm like, ma'am, it's been a week,
Yep.
maybe a week and a half. Like, what is going on here? But it's fine, whatever. Ivan is not who she thought he was. And so there's the like, oh no, strange men are in my house. That is scary. But then there's the deeper emotional pain of like, oh no, I've been betrayed. I've been abandoned by this dude who's supposed to love me. And then all of that is also wrapped up in like financial security because she quit her job and like all of these things. So it's like a series of bubbles that burst over the course of the film, and you're just watching her as she's having to deal with new information, new people that she's having to interact with, and just I love watching her like study a situation and modulate her response to it. And there's so many times when she'll be trying to communicate with somebody and they're not listening to her, and so she'll try it a different way. So she'll start yelling and insulting and all of that, and that doesn't work. So then she'll lower her voice and she will try to speak calmly and eloquently to plead her case. And then when that doesn't work, she tries something else. And so there's so much about Annie to just absolutely love and want to root for, as she is just really just having everything kind of fall apart all around her and having all of her bubbles burst at once. And it's so interesting to watch her respond as things just keep going wrong, and as she realizes that the maybe the fairy tale that she has imagined is actually not true.
Yeah, yeah. She is totally a character that we immediately root for. It's very similar to Uncut Gems in a lot of ways. Like as problematic as Adam Sandler's character was, there's something that you just want the best for him, you know? And I think in Anora, we immediately feel a load of character empathy for her, because she advocates for herself and she stands up for what she believes in and demands the respect that she knows that she deserves. And to see this woman who is advocating for her agency again and again and again over the course of this film, especially in that middle sequence, like she just is like yelling into the abyss. It's hard to watch. And I think it also immediately, like as a woman, especially watching this movie, like you're just like, she is trying everything she can. Like you mentioned, every tool that she has in her toolbox to be heard and continually ignored again and again. And so I think like, I mean, how could you not root for that, you know? And so I think that is a really efficient way that we see those sides of her in the opening of the film. Like she knows what she wants, she goes after it, and she's kind of fearless in that way. But it's hard to watch it continuously get denied towards the middle and final acts of the film because you see that fighting spirit in her, and there just isn't place that has been created for her to be heard by the men that are around her in her orbit for the bulk of the film. But man, we immediately advocate for a woman who is advocating for herself.
And I love that from the very beginning, she is advocating for herself in the club. You know, she's advocating for a better workplace for her and her coworkers. And she's talking about the DJ that disrespected her. And then a little bit later on when he wouldn't give her a week off, she starts talking about like, well, when you give me workman's comp, when I get a 401k, then you can tell me about my schedule. And so I loved those little moments of her advocating for herself and standing up for herself and for her fellow coworkers too, and advocating for better business practices at her workplace. And so I love that the film starts there, and then you see her boldness and her willingness to call out things that aren't right all throughout the film. And like you mentioned, there's that through line of all of the men just not listening to her, but she continues to raise her voice and stand up for herself. And we love to see that. I was rooting for her for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Me too. One of the predominating thoughts for me over the course of the film is like, does she believe this fairy tale? Because my theory is that like, I think like she's so sharp. She's so intuitive. Her EQ is off the chart. She can read and understand so many of the social dynamics and situations. Like she's sharp, you know, she's had to survive on her own and navigate these really complicated landscapes of like identifying and picking the opportunities that she's looking for when she's at the club, right? Like she has got the chops on her. And so my theory is that deep down, I think she knows that this probably isn't real, but there's always that side of us that just hopes that it is and hopes for the fairy tale and hopes for the fantasy. And so I think that's a fascinating, like, implicit character dynamic that is at play here, which is we don't know what she believes because she starts out the relationship and it is transactional and she's focused on trying to make her monies, you know, and obviously it takes a different direction. But the whole time I'm like, Homegirl might just be like real strategic to try and get the most amount of money as she can from the situation because she is sharp and she is savvy. And I think it's a larger point that the film makes with the denouement sequence of like what this all really meant for her. And I don't think that she's mourning and she's crying at the end of the movie about the loss of the relationship or the loss of this love that she had with Ivan. I think it's the recognition of how much that she's never been given, the safety and security of affection given in an environment that she longs for. Like, I think that's the thing that she's mourning at the end. And so I think that there's a fascinating, like, understanding of the character that the film chooses not to allow us as the viewers into fully. Like, we don't know fully what she's thinking throughout this whole second and third acts of the movie. And I think that's really great. I think it's really well done because she's not made to be this like naive female protagonist. I think she's played up to be incredibly sharp. And so there's a complicated like push and pull within her of like maybe deep down she knows what's true and the other part of her is hoping for something to be better than it actually is in reality. How did you read her
Yeah.
and kind of like how much she's truly been swept up, or just like allowing at least a part of her to be swept up and not fully?
Yeah, she's definitely a more complicated protagonist. And I appreciate that the film kind of leaves it open for interpretation too, and you can kind of ascribe to her certain maybe feelings or motivations. And I think there are multiple readings of Annie and multiple readings of the film that are all in there. I think I think she was probably a mix of savvy, honestly, like businesswoman
Yeah.
and and getting swept up in it. I think that the first act especially, it's the way that it's cut together and the way that it's filmed, I feel like creates that feeling of intoxication almost. And you are swept up in it. You see the money, you see the trips, you see the fun, and it's like, oh, okay. Like I get how, especially like a young woman could get kind of swept up in this, even somebody as savvy as Annie. So I definitely do think it's a mix of both, because it does start out as transactional. And I mean, like 15K to be somebody's girlfriend for a week, like that's a pretty good week. But I do think it's a mix. And I think part of what we see throughout the film as she is fighting for this relationship is also security that money would provide. And it could also be some of that almost like almost beating herself up for landing herself in this situation. Like, when you know better and then you do a thing and everything goes wrong, and then you try and cling to it because you don't want to be wrong because you know better. Like, I wonder if there's a little bit of that in there. So I think that there's a lot of emotion to Annie, and the reason why she's doing these things, it's not just one thing, because that's not how human beings are. And so I think it's just a mix of a lot of things that she's going through. And I appreciate that the film is vague enough so that those things can all coexist in her. Yeah, she's so complex, and she's not like overly written. I think we get enough to empathize with her and go along this journey with her, and there's still some mystery there, but it's not too much. It's really just right how they've written this character.
Yeah, because sometimes films can give us a really complex character, but the film allows us to explore all of the rooms of this complex human and view them all together, right? And I think that in Anora, we get like the crack open for each of those rooms that make up the complexities of her, but we're not necessarily invited in fully to explore and understand all of these dimensions of her. I think that they are evidenced and come out in very specific ways throughout the film, but by the end of the film, like there's so much of her that is unknowable to us as the viewers. And I love that. I think that's really a great addition to this film that, like you mentioned, doesn't overwrite her. Like we don't have a full understanding of her by the end, but we have enough to want to ponder and think about like what was going through her mind, and what is she thinking, and what were her hopes and desires that might have led her down this path. And especially by the end of the film, you're like, where will she go from here? Like, we have no idea. She could go in a million other directions. This could be a turning point for her and an opportunity for growth and evolution. It also could be a trigger for descent into a really bad headspace. And all of those are possible. And kind of her being at the crossroads at the end there is really fascinating too. So I just love how noble this protagonist is, and also how open-ended that ending is too.
Yeah, I was also left wondering, like, what is next for her? And the film is uninterested in that, as it should be. I love that This film is narrow in scope, and it knows what it wants to explore, and that's all that it does, and it does it so effectively. But I think because it's so effective in its execution, it made me wonder what's next for this character, because we built up just so much, I don't empathy, at some points admiration for this character, and so I just want good for her. And so I am going to imagine that she went on to live a really great life that she wanted to live, because I want good things for her. But the film doesn't say that, and I love that it chooses that level of ambiguity and just leaving you to sit and wonder.
Yeah, man. It's so different from the typical narrative structure that we would get in a feature-length film. You know, like usually this moment happens somewhere in the middle, the two-thirds mark, and then we see how our character builds and either descends into more chaos and a more negative headspace, or rebuilds and charts a new path forward, right? And this film chooses to end on this moment of catharsis, but also this moment of like having to face a really hard, raw truth. And when that happens for us as humans, we usually take one of many directions, but usually either it really hardens us and it's so painful that we can't look at it again, and we run from it in all of the unhealthiest ways, or we have this opportunity to have this really hard truth and surfaced up, and it's an opportunity for healing and growth and evolution. And the film leaves us like right smack dab in the like thick of that moment, and then cuts to the ending credits. And I love that choice. It's so different from films that have a like clear trajectory of like, oh, and our character's back on the path towards growth, or they're in the path towards descent, and this film just leaves us hanging in midair. And I love it. I think that's really fascinating and really smart to do. But what is true is that this character has achieved a moment of facing a hard truth, coming straight up head to head with it, and there feels like a feeling of catharsis that is also woven in there as well, of like it being finally able to be released in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This part of her life has come to a conclusion. Like, this adventure that she has been on for 2 hours has come to an end. And that's it. Like, it's such a fitting ending. And we touched on it a little bit earlier, but I love that the final scene is so quiet, because we have just spent most of the last 2 hours plus just loud environments, chaos, running, all of this. And the only thing that you hear in the final scene is just the squeaking of Iger's windshield wipers on the car. And that's it. And it's just silent and still. And it's so jarring. Again, I feel like even in this scene, we are in Annie's headspace too, because she has just been through this whirlwind romance, and then this crazy running around trying to find her husband and flying back to Las Vegas to get a divorce and all of these things. And this is maybe the first time that she's actually had to like sit with reality. And it hits her in the face, just like the silence hits us in the face. And so it's so jarring, but so purposeful. And I think getting us in her mindset, or just maybe even allowing us to empathize with her to a degree in that moment. And it's just, it's like you said, there is this feeling of a catharsis and a letting go, and like, okay, that adventure is over. What next? Credits roll.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so accurate. Like it's in those quiet moments that like the hard truths just come out, you know what I mean? Like they're not there's no space for them when you're in the middle of a Vegas casino and having the time of your life or running around town trying to find this dude. Like that's not when in the action, in the busyness, those things don't have space to come. But man, when you slow down and everything, the dust settles, then you have time to really process. And I think that's what happens with her in that moment too. Is like it's all now beginning to really hit her now that she's had time to sit and process. And yeah, very accurate. Windshield wipers going.
Yeah. Yeah, I viewed it the same way because I think even when they're back at the mansion, you know, she still has her walls up and it's probably still the adrenaline from everything, exhaustion from everything because she's been up for how many hours and being like dragged all over New York. And so like the adrenaline, the walls, the everything, even the to-dos of like, oh, I need to get all of my crap out of this house because I have to be gone tomorrow. Like it's still in that go mode. And then in this moment, it's like, oh, all the walls come down and everything finally hits her of the past, however much time this has been. And yeah, it'll get you. Like, it's always the times when it's the least convenient, when you don't want it, that is when everything will hit you. And I think that's some of what we see in that final scene.
Yep. Yeah. It's so accurate. It's so accurate. And then, like you mentioned earlier, the near silent ending credits, wild. Like the movie's also like, yo, you too, viewer, need some quiet time to process this journey too. Welcome to the quiet now, as you sit in your theater or wherever you're watching this, and just also just breathless. Time to catch your breath.
Honestly, though, like that is absolutely what it is. You know, it is this feeling of, oh, okay, I can breathe again. Like, because the whole movie, and we've talked about it, the movie is going so fast. And so there are times in the movie where I found myself holding my breath because it was just so much happening. And I was so like overstimulated, not as bad as Uncut Gems, but like still overwhelmed at just the speed and the pace and the editing and the sound and everything is overwhelming. And then you get to that final scene and it's so quiet and then the quiet is overwhelming and then you're having this suddenly emotional moment and you're like, oh my gosh, what do we do? And then the credits roll and you're like, oh, okay, it's over. Yeah. And so I love the emotional awareness of Sean Baker and the entire team to know that those credits needed to be quiet. Yeah. You know, we couldn't have the film end and then immediately we're listening to like club music again or whatever. Like, no. Yeah. We needed to continue that journey into the silence and into the stillness just to reflect on everything and I don't know, almost like emerge back into our normal lives. Mm-hmm.
You know, it's so interesting. I was reading an article with Sean Baker and team, and they were talking about that ending scene and how they had a couple different versions of it where after that moment in the car, Annie and Igor get out and he kind of like helps her bring her stuff up the stairs and they do the whole like awkward small talk thing and then the movie ends. And they then intentionally felt like, no, the movie needs to end without all of that. Like the movie cuts right from that moment and drops you into the ending credits. And I think that was spot on with the intuition to know that that's what we needed to sit with. Like, don't ease us out of it, you know, like actually leave us there and then just roll the ending credits so that we're forced to face the depth of the emotion that she's feeling in that moment, you know, like we too can't just easily transition out and have some awkward small talk, because awkward small talk often is that transition out of like really emotional moments. And I love that the film doesn't allow us to have that like little escape and transition out either. Like we don't get to have that too, which I think is genius.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's in line with the rest of the film too, because the film is just constantly in your face and everything is so big. And so I think it would make sense that the ending also needs to be so big, which I didn't realize that like silence could be big, but I feel like in this film, the silence is so powerful because it's so different than everything that we've experienced. So yeah, I think awkward small talk
Nope.
would have maybe ruined the movie.
Yeah.
That might be dramatic,
No, I think
but okay, great. Yeah, I think it would have ruined the movie. Because, man, that ending, like, you really do just, like, have to sit there. You just feel like you've been punched in the face and you just need to sit there for a second. And small talk would have been like, oh, it's not over? Like, wait, what?
yeah.
It would have been confusing.
Especially because so much of the film, like we're laughing along, like we're kind of swept along for the ride, and it's fun and lighthearted. It's cognitively horrifying, but like emotionally and tonally, like you're laughing along with it. And then boom, it just that ending casts such a sh- a color over the rest of the film that you just watched too. Which I think is really interesting and important for us to feel the length of that color and the presence of that ending scene as we rethink the whole journey that we went on. I think it's important for us to have the time to like go there and to zoom out of our whole experience and realize like, man, like she really did go through a lot, and like we had a time going through it with her, but like to then see the depth of emotion for her, I think is significant. It's just this movie could have ended like much more lighthearted too, but the choice to like hit you with that gut punch, I loved it. I ate it up.
And I think it's also connected to something that we were saying a little bit earlier about Annie kind of being a little mysterious. And
Yeah, that's good.
and I feel like that ending scene is one of those of like, oh, what is she thinking? What's going on inside of her that is causing all of these various emotions that are happening in this car. And so I feel like that ending scene just immediately going into the end credits allows that time to be like reflecting on this character and kind of inspecting like, oh, okay, who is she? Have we learned something more about who she is in this ending scene? What does this tell us about her, in addition to, like you were saying, reflecting on the entire journey?
Yeah, that's a really great point, because for most of the movie, like we've talked about earlier, she is kind of a mystery. Like we're let into a few of her layers, but there's obviously an awareness that there's so much more to her. We don't know yet, and we haven't been invited into those rooms yet. And then that that moment at the end of the film, like it's such a vulnerable moment for her, and we've never seen that from her yet in this film. She's always been tough and advocating for herself and keeping this like keeping it all together, like holding it all together in this feeling of strength that she's trying to hold on to and exhibit as she's going through a crazy situation. And there's such softness and vulnerability in that ending moment that it's a whole new layer that has been peeled back for our main character. And so it just begs you to like view her through like the depths of her and all of the soft parts of her, in addition to all of the other sides and exterior like facades that she's put up for the rest of the film, out of survival really and having to navigate the world. And so you just kind of also wonder like what life she's lived and what she's experienced, and what her childhood was like. Was she allowed to be a child? There's just so many questions that start to like form about who she is and what she's experienced that has led her to this point in this chapter of her life.
Mm-hmm. And we will never know.
We will never know, which is also genius. Still a
Yes,
mystery.
it's so smart.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't need to know all of those things. We know enough of who she is. And yeah, just the 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 more that I think about this film, the more impressed I am with the writing. Like, to be able to craft this character in this way, I think is just really, really impressive. And then on top of that, you have all of the great dialogue and all of these things. But to make Annie as three-dimensional and as interesting as she is, while also not sharing everything and leaving in that little bit of mystery too, but not too much. It's like a real Goldilocks situation we have here. And they absolutely nailed how to write this character, because she is a person that you want to root for, and it's a person that you have questions about, but not in a bad way. And it's, yeah, I mean, how often do you get characters that are just like so perfectly written like that? And this film really hinges on the character of Annie being somebody that you want to spend time with, you want to root for her, and they nailed it in Anora.
Yeah. Yep. The precision of the tone and details, and it's all so well done, so precise. Any other last big things that we want to mention about Anora before we wrap? Time flew, man.
Yeah, it really did. I think one of the pieces that I absolutely loved is Ivan's parents. And you know, we're first introduced to his dad because Ivan says, "Hey, just Google him. This is his name. Google him." And so we know he's a big deal. He's an oligarch. Okay, we can draw some conclusions from that. And then we meet the henchmen that were sent by the parents, but we still haven't seen the parents. We haven't heard the parents, except we hear the mom screaming out of the phone, but we don't hear what she's saying. And I loved that buildup of tension until we see the parents show up. And his mom, utterly terrifying.
Yeah.
Dad, hilarious. Yeah. Like, I really think, especially when they're in Vegas and Annie just goes off, I think that Ivan's dad fell in love with her and would have been so happy for her to be part of the family in that moment, because he's just laughing his head off. But mom is the one who is in charge. And mom, ooh, she's scary. I would also run away if she was coming to New York to get me and was not happy with me. So I loved that setup of the parents, and we don't see them for so long. And when we finally do, it's such a great payoff. And you think, because the dad is the oligarch, that he's going to be the scary one. And it ends up being the mom. And even Ivan's dad is terrified of mom and doesn't want to give her bad news. So I thought that was just brilliantly written. So good.
I love the part where the dad's just laughing his head off.
Oh,
and then you're
it's
also
perfect.
Just like, well, this is why Ivan is the way that he is too. You know?
Right?
This makes so much sense now. That tracks. Okay, well, this is our review and discussion of Anora. You can find it available, oh my gosh, where? I'm sure as we head into Oscar season that this will be available out in theaters and hopefully on streaming soon, because everyone needs to watch this movie. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Movies and Us. Our name sums it up. We're all about movies and the powerful ways we connect with each other and the world around us. This podcast is about all of us and our shared stories, so everyone is welcome here, and we're so glad you spent time with us today. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune to your favorite shows. Drop us a rating and review. Let us know your thoughts about Anora. You can connect with us on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at moviesandUsPod, or email us at moviesandUspod@gmail.com. We will be back next week to discuss the film The Substance. We hope you have an amazing week, and we'll talk again soon.